experience and wisdom impressed the viewer, was captured by his inquisitive gaze. In his portrait, he looks severe, and his competitors know it. His clothes are carefully chosen. Holding an item of the latest technology, one can see his command on the latest technology and his high level of education. Indeed, the elements of this portrait show a strong man, a charismatic leader, able to lead us all to that hopeful future. Good evening. Steve Jobs was a charismatic leader. Now, there are a lot of people who loved him, there are a lot of people who hated him. I come in the second group. But it can't be denied that this man had style, he had panache, and when he came on stage, people listened to him. Because he revolutionized the digital world, he changed the way we looked at mobile phones, he brought in the whole concept of smartphones. So he was actually a leader and he had charisma. These words fit with him perfectly. However, these words weren't used with respect to Steve Jobs, they were used with respect to this man, Pope Innocent X, the Pope who, well, many perceive as the first true leader, true CEO in one way, of the very first global player in the field of faith and religion, the Roman Catholic Church. These two gentlemen hail from very different eras. This guy from 2010, this picture is taken in 2010, that one's been taken in 1650. And yet the exact same thing applies to both of them. Because of 3 or 4 very, very common traits which are common to them. One is that they're both sitting in a particular manner which shows their confidence, it shows their strength. They both tilted their faces in a certain manner, their gazes are sharp. Anyone who's sitting in the audience is going to be encapsulated by what they're trying to say, is going to be enchanted by whatever they're going to say, because their gazes hold steady. Their gazes hold anyone who's over there, forces them to pay attention to what is being spoken. Additionally, if you see in Pope Innocent X, and you see what is actually a memo that he's written. Now these memos were distributed all over the country, and these were taken to be gospel, these were taken to be the rules. That was the modern technology of that day. Today, the modern technology is the iPad. Clearly, both of them had a very, very specific hold on whatever was the latest in technology, and they brought it out in these portraitures of themselves when they were made. And if you look at the background, you clearly see the amount of effort that's gone into indicating a certain feeling. We'll go into that in a little while, but indicating a certain amount of a plushness, a certain amount of luxury in the way the both of them are sitting. Kranthi wanted to speak a little bit.
So this is another portrait which Francis Bacon was made in 1950. This was one which was done in the 16th century. So here we are going to learn other aspects of leadership based on the context in which it was being made. So this was made around 1953 after around Second World War. This shows that the Pope, in this picture the Pope shows that he is in a very powerful and authoritative position. If you see that picture, it shows that Pope is screaming. Why do you think he is screaming out? He's actually screaming because he was in such an authoritative position, but he couldn't be able to do anything. For example, he couldn't be able to prevent the genocide of what was happening in Germany at that time. In fact, he couldn't be able to do many things in the world which he could have done. This shows that too much authoritativity shouldn't be made in a particular individual. Individuality should be reduced as much as it can. This can be even attributed to the other contemporary leaders at the time of even Mussolini or Hitler. Too much authority was being in their hands and they went against the people. So they were in a position that no one can actually defeat them or disobey them, but they were being crushed to death. So it is ultimately shows that ultimately the people and only people who are creators of history. No individual is above the people, And this can even be compared to a corporate industry. CEO or any other manager can't go against his employees or the environment which he operates on, or even on the surroundings which the company offers. Company responsible for it. And there was even a scenario recently in Europe. If the CEO or the manager supports the people and if he goes against the wishes of the people, he will be equally targeted for. For example, there was a company in Europe recently in which the employees were actually protesting against the resign of their CEO. So this type of circumstances you have. So ultimately we can learn from this is individuality shouldn't be that much. and the individual cannot go against the wishes of the people or his subordinates.
Right. That is one viewpoint, but we need to understand that these portraits have been made from the perspective of Western art in terms of Western culture. And a very, very important aspect of Western culture is that leadership primarily is associated with individuals. There's a tremendous amount of interassociation between individualism and leadership which is not so evident in countries in the Oriental area such as, for that matter, India or China. Now, coming back to the topic on hand. These are some of the statements which have been made by a number of researchers in the field of leadership and post-portraiture. Now what they're saying is that images of contemporary leaders, this is Kranthi and Jackson, they've done a lot of work in the field. Images of contemporary leaders like CEOs are produced and disseminated by commercial organizations, and many seek to convey a visual impression of commercial organizations themselves. Now, we saw in the case of Steve Jobs that he's wearing this turtleneck and jeans, and this is sort of also a reflection of the culture that is in Apple. This is something that, if you were to look at Mark Zuckerberg, for example, in Facebook, all of them wear flip-flops and socks, and their design element is not the sort of tie that they wear. Their design element instead is the socks that they wear. Normally they wear asymmetric socks. So that's something that Facebook has tried to inculcate, and that is something that comes from the fact that their leader, Mark Zuckerberg, started this culture, and that sort of spread to the others in the field. Similarly, if you were to look at the history of Western art, the link between portraits and status of power has been widely documented. In fact, you need to understand, we've already spoken about this, we've already seen this in lectures. Commissioning paintings was a very, very expensive activity, and this was therefore restricted to people who had the wealth, who had the affluence to do it. So we've seen a little while how paintings have shifted from being purely displays of power, but to also displays of wealth. The term charisma applies to a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and is treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specific powers or qualities. And so when you're looking at portraitures, this is perhaps the key point here in terms of what we're trying to say. When you're looking at portraitures, when you examine portraits of a particular kind or text, you can actually come up with very interesting insights regarding what is considered leadership, what is considered charisma, and what is considered as affluence/power in a particular day and age. And that is what we're going to do. But to do that, we first need to understand what portraits are. Now, portraits are essentially works of art that represent the features or likeness of a unique individual. Point to be noted, they are works of art, which means that it's not necessarily objective. There's a lot of subjectivity which comes in because the artist is also involved. It's not necessarily just a photograph. In the case of Steve Jobs, you may say it's a photograph, but you'll realize there is an artist involved. Steve Jobs himself has portrayed himself in a certain manner. When we look at these releases of various movies that come out, it's not something that's happened by mistake. The fact that the iPhone got left at a bar by one of the testers isn't a mistake, it was carefully planned. So these things happen, these are part of the portraiture of these products and these entities. As a work of art, portraits are also influenced by certain aesthetic conventions of the time. So for example, if you were to look at art in India right now, there would be a certain amount of context that comes in because of the presence of the people who are around it. Similarly, if you're looking at portraiture, it has a tremendous impact on it from the people who surround it, from the culture of the day and age. And it has a definite social meaning. So what essentially portraiture does is three things. One, it is a piece of art. There's a way to not only provide the objective details of the person's face and his physique, but also add a certain amount of artistic elements into this whole portraiture that is being made. So what it does is portraiture allows for, enables this character to gain certain qualities which he may not have, and it also allows him to portray certain qualities that people may not know. And in this regard, portraitures can also be used very powerfully as tools in politics. Now, a question to all those people sitting here: which of these people looks more powerful, looks more scary? Put in. Everyone put in. Right. It's really interesting because in the day and age when this painting was painted, this guy is actually one guy you would have heard of. It's called Napoleon. In the day and age when this painting was painted, people used to be scared of this painting. No one looked the painting in the eye because it was considered to be a very, very powerful message of a person with a lot of strength, with a lot of charisma, with a lot of violence behind him. And this was essentially portrayed because this person standing with one leg in front and his hand in the label is essentially what in that time was considered a sign of power, a sign of affluence, a sign of someone with a lot of charisma. So Napoleon in that day was considered powerful because of these portraits which were set up all over his kingdom. Today we look at the portrait, we don't really feel what was felt at that point of time. That is the social context that comes in with portraiture. Another thing, of course, this guy would also be known to all of you. This is Alexander the Great. Now what they did in terms of portraiture here was they took his face, they inscribed it onto scenes, and this was the first time it happened that a particular person's face was inscribed on coins and on all those things used in commerce, and it was used across this spread, almost till India on this side, in Egypt and over there in Greece. So across this area, his name became synonymous with economic might. His name became synonymous with commerce, and that is how they used these elements, portraiture, to create sort of like an association of commerce and growth with Alexander the Great, which is what later on became known as one of his biggest things. He was known as the person who went about and created business. Nothing of that sort happened. He actually just put his face on business entities. Another guy who's really, really famous in this regard is King Philip IV of Spain. He's a very, very good friend of our earlier friend, the Pope, what is his name? Innocent X. He was the ruler of Spain, and what happened is, if you could read this, such was the power of his image that the elites of the Viceroyalty of Peru took oaths of loyalty and admiration for the king in a highly charged ceremony where a portrait of the king, framed in gold and seated on a throne beneath the canopy, presided over the ritual. They essentially gave up their right to rule purely on the basis of the picture that was put on. And to put this thing in context, these were the very same people, this Viceroyalty of Peru were the very same people who taken that entire kingdom that was the Inca civilization and decimated it in the period of just 50 years. And these were the people who sort of were scared based on the picture and what it portrayed. Because the picture essentially portrayed that this was a man who was not just, well, from his face he looks stern, but he was also a man, because of the things that have been included in the picture, we look at it in a little while, who had a lot of power, who had a lot of affluence, and who was very well connected to, as I mentioned, the Pope of the time. And that was what got these people to surrender their control of these lands. Now, much of the portraiture, as I mentioned, during the early Renaissance was guided by the church. So there was this degree of the innovation, the veneration and relics of saints, which also controlled portraiture of various kings and others who wanted to get their portraits made. So if you had to make a portrait of this kind, which involved all these elements, you had to take, in a way, permission of the church. So the church controlled it to a huge extent, which is why portraitures, in a way, gave you the permission, or gave people the impression that you had a certain amount of influence in Rome as well. Now, with the changing landscape of the Renaissance, the bourgeoisie started commissioning portraits to indicate their increasing power. They showed that they are gaining affluence, and they started coming up with various ways of showing their affluence, which was through portraiture. Now, what happened was they commissioned a lot of artists of the time. These artists were asked to come up with something very different so as to indicate this power that these people have gained. So a lot of artists came about, they created a lot of new styles. Impressionism, for example, started off at this time because of purely this sort of patronship in terms of people who wanted portraitures. Now, this brought about another aspect of portraiture, which was the commissioning of a genius. Another pop quiz. How many of you know who this person is? She's very famous. Any guesses? Right. How many of you don't know who this person is? They're essentially the same person. She is Lisa Gherardini, better known from that picture as the Mona Lisa. Now, the only reason why that picture, they're the same person. In fact, this person sort of shows her in a better light, I personally feel. But and they were painted about 5 years from each other. The only reason that picture is more famous, only reason her husband paid so much more for that picture, was because it was made by a certain man known as Leonardo da Vinci, which essentially got them control of a portraiture which was the best known, the most visited, the most written about, the most sung about, the most parodied work of art in the world, purely by commissioning a person who was famous, purely by commissioning a person who was known to be a genius. That is where this whole concept of geniuses sort of took off. Now, what we've seen essentially is now what Kranthi was trying to say is power shouldn't be given to the individual, the power should be with the people. Now, Michael Foucault says that this power that individual has actually comes from the group of people. What it says is that the power is something that is given to someone, not because he has it, but because others don't. There's sort of like a gradient in power among people in the society, various strata of society, and this is what creates this dynamics in terms of power, and that is what Foucault was saying. And he says that there were certain dispositives which power is exercised through complex dispositives. Now, dispositives are essentially institutional, physical, and administrative mechanisms, and of course knowledge structures which enhance and maintain the exercise of power within the social body. So therefore, when we look at portraitures, this is something that is happening in portraitures as well. We've got people who show their affluence, who show their power through portraitures in terms of kings and popes and all. We also see people who've gained affluence, who've tried to use portraiture to show that. So clearly portraiture may thus be considered a dispositive power for the visual representation of charisma and status, and hence portraiture is a new technology of power serving as testimony of an overwhelming power. It is important therefore that we try and understand what are the aspects of this new technology and how can we then use it for various purposes, which brings us to the ingredients of portraiture. Now, there are 4 key ingredients that we have identified. 3 were in the text, 1 more has been identified. The first is the frame. Now, the frame is essentially the objective values that are included in the portraiture. So, if someone were to make a portrait of me, it would include my face, my body, my physical structure. The gaze is what the artist tries to add to it, the little elements that the artist tries to add to it to try and create a story around my physical attributes. This is what the subjectivity of the art is bringing, which is why, since it's a piece of art, there's always a subjective nature to it. There's also, of course, the period eye. We saw it with the case of Napoleon and Putin. In various times, various things are interpreted differently, which is why it is very important when you're coming up with a piece of art that you identify what is it that the society perceives as powerful, what it is that the society perceives as affluence, and that is what you try to incorporate in this. And of course, there's the genius. So, if if a book of mine were to be written by Adil, it would sell for 7 million. If I were to write it myself, it wouldn't sell at all. So that's something that sort of happens because of the fact that someone has a brand value associated with it. Now, which brings us to the second part of the plot.
So, what are this? These are the titles of the topics which we are given before presentations. So, most of the what are the significance of the titles and how actually make it to a good title? Most of the titles here, if you see, those are really good, and we feel like going it and reading about those particular topics. The titles differ from the various things like the frame, the grace and period. I mean, it should be more attractive to the audience which you are catering to, and it should be more meaningful so that the audience actually look into the topic inside it, and it should be appealing to the readers when they actually read the title. And it also depends upon the author who is writing that particular book. For example, if you see J.K. Rowling, if she introduces another book, most of the people will be reading it, irrespective of what the content inside it. So it depends upon the author as well as the title and the meaningful persuasiveness of it makes into the title content.
So we haven't really been very creative in this. So this is our framework of the title of the article. So we are going to use this and certain other elements to try and proceed further. So now what we've seen is portraiture, and we've seen how titles of articles are in essence a representative of the content that is therein, and also sort of incentivizer to try and get people to read the content as such and to perhaps respect it in the case of say J.K. Rowling's content. So we've seen titles, we've seen portraiture. What is it that in a managerial domain brings these two together? The answer, pretty straightforward, is the logo. Now, the logos are a very, very critical aspect of business and marketing. As a company's major graphical representation, a logo anchors a company's brand and becomes the single most visible manifestation of the company within the target market. So when I look at a Reliance logo, for example, or I look at an Apple logo, they give to me different impressions of the company because that is what has been built into these logos. For this reason, a well-designed logo is an essential part of any company's overall marketing strategy, and it is therefore a representative of what the company is trying to make people perceive it as. So, of course, since it's therefore a portraiture of what the company is, it's a headline, it's sort of like the title of what the company is, it's important that we try to analyze these logos from the perspective of our course, is the frame. Now these are the logos of Starbucks from 1992 and what they've done in 2011. You see, very, very straightforward, only two things have gone up. Starbucks as a name has gone up and coffee has left the impression. Now, here's the objective bit to the branding. What they've understood is that the figure in between, who's actually a mermaid, is herself symbol is a symbol already of Starbucks. Also in 2011, Starbucks decided to diversify. They went into wine, they went into food products, they also went into real estate. At this point of time, just a simple association with coffee couldn't continue. So what they did was they got rid of the Starbucks logo. They said this logo is sufficient and they got rid of coffee. Of course, this created a little bit of problem in Saudi Arabia because in Saudi Arabia, she was considered a devil. And so they couldn't put her up. So they technically don't have a symbol there. I don't know what they're doing over there. But essentially, this is the objective bit about it. This is the absolute value. The company has changed its strategy. The company has changed what it stands for, and therefore that is being represented here. Now here is something else. Now we realize that a lot of colors portray a lot of different things. Here are 6 or 7 colors which have been indicated to mean optimism, being friendly, excitement, creativity, trust, peaceful, balance, stuff that you would like to associate with your brand. What happens is a lot of companies use these colors so as to give this perception to the user, give this perception to the consumer that this is something that the company identifies with. You will see that all of them actually fall into the proper category in that respect. So this is the case. This is where the artist comes in. This is what the company projects as a perception around the brand itself. Now, another question to all people present here. What is common to these 3 brands? Smiley. What's a smiley? Smiley, right? Why do you think they introduced a smiley into the brand?
Expressions.
What is the expression? What does the smiley express? Happiness, right? Precisely. Now, what is really interesting is, prior to 1970, had I asked you people the same question, you wouldn't have been able to answer because people did not perceive a colon and the parenthesis to mean a happy face. That perception just wasn't there. It actually started off, in fact, there's a movie called Forrest Gump in which they actually say that while he was running, he cleaned his face and that gave rise to the smiley. The smiley bumper sticker started off in the 1970s, and it is only after that that people have started associating these symbols with happy faces, these symbols, these emoticons. So anytime you see these emoticons being used today, just imagine in the 1800s if someone had come out with a Yahoo thing looking like this or Traveler looking like that, people wouldn't have understood what they're trying to convey. So this is very, very much based in the period. These brands are very much based in the current period, which clearly indicates that the period is a very, very important part of the logo as well. And finally, of course, the genius. We want to be associated with the genius. So as Siva is wearing a shirt as well, which associates with the genius. So the genius here is I am Calcutta. We see a certain value associated with this logo, and we want to be associated with that logo, which is why we go and use it. Just in case of Leonardo da Vinci painting the picture, nothing else was great about it. Of course, there are a lot of things that you will talk about because it's Leonardo da Vinci's work. Had I done the same thing, people wouldn't really have said that it's a particularly great piece of art. But it's because I am Calcutta's logo is on the shirt that the shirt gains value, and because you're wearing the shirt, you tend to gain value. You work. One of the reasons why we are here is to gain value from this brand, and that is the genius of it all. So essentially in terms of frame, essentially in terms of case, essentially in terms of period of eye and the genius, the logo is a clear manifestation of indication of leadership, indication of the portraiture in the modern managerial world.